not to involve yourself, and if possible, not even to be seen. Okay? But these beings who came here were what you would call in Milton the fallen angels, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And they had an agenda that did want to interfere with the Homo sapien at that time. So they started to corral, and they started to research all of the life forms and all of the peoples of the earth at that time. And they started to corral, just like in the movie Planet of the Apes, they show this. They started to corral the people onto this place of Atlantis and started to check into their entire biology. And then at a certain point, thousands of years later, not immediately, because it takes time to set up all of these things, genetic changes were done. And the result being that almost all the original Homo sapiens were either changed, and those who weren't changed were killed or created into slaves and subsequently faded out. And the being that they created, we might want to term Homo Atlantis. A being that has pure alien DNA and has pure human DNA. Okay? Homo Atlantis, from which we are all descended. But the euphemism, or the poetic euphemism for these people, is called the Sons of the Serpent. Because, like I said, the original people were called the Brotherhood of the Snake, or the Serpent people. Not because they look like serpents, and we'll come to why they really were called the serpents in a minute. But their first progeny was called the Sons of the Serpent. And that's why we have in the Bible the term, it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness." Right? They're telling you all about this in the book of Genesis. And by the way, does anybody know that the word Genesis even means the genes of the goddess Isis? Or the generation of Isis? Implying something? And in fact, the Bible, when it uses the word created, it's actually a mistranslation of a word that is actually more like our word build or construct. You know? So this is what we also have the term the firstborn. In the Bible, what we have to understand, because also, think of it, why would the angel of death or God, like even in Herod, you know, and later on before in the Pharaoh's time, what would be the importance of going and killing the firstborn of your enemies? Sure, wouldn't it be smarter to go and kill your enemy and have done with it? Why are you going to wait to kill all his firstborns? See? And secondly, no such atrocity happened. There's never any record of any massacre of any innocents or anything like that in physical record at all. So the firstborn is another one of these cryptic terms, and it's a reference to the Sons of the Serpent race, also known as the children of the Elohim. Some people might want to call the original serpent masters the Jehovah clan, the term that's spoken of in the Bible, and others might want to call the first group, their firstborn, the Elohim. Now, Christians will not understand this. What are you talking about? There is a rule of thumb that you can use in the Bible to make things a lot easier, and that is whenever you're hearing a term like that, especially Adam and Eve and Jehovah and Elohim, try to think less of an individual and more as a race. Okay, a group of people at least. And then things will start to be clear. Now they created this firstborn to serve them. And they did it by genetically changing the human and alien DNA together at the place we call Atlantis. But as time went by, maybe hundreds of years, nobody knows exactly the dates. The original visitation, of course, was what? 50,000 years ago. And we have, from that time, a great deluge. Remember when the planet Tiamat was destroyed, it said as debris fell into the earth and created enormous cataclysms. But it didn't create a pole shift, it just created enormous cataclysms that changed the face of the earth forever. But at least that kind of contamination slowly did subside over time. It was devastating, and many, many people died, and lots of changes in the land. But it was not so awesome, you see, that over a few hundred years, a certain amount of normalcy did not come back. Because the earth has been visited by that kind of trouble many, many times. But anyway, when they created this firstborn, they sent the firstborn out to be their servants, to actually go out into the Garden of Eden, into Atlantis, Appalachia, and their territories that they were conquering, and do their physical work for them. But after a certain period of time, these sons of the serpent had the human DNA. And therefore they had the humanity, the humanism, and the sense of spiritual connectedness to things, that sensibility that their own fathers didn't have. And it dawned on these sons of the serpent that finally they realized, to cut a long story short, that they didn't want to serve these masters anymore, because they probably didn't agree with them and didn't like doing this and didn't feel that they should be subservient. And it's interesting too, because they had the high intelligence and the divine spiritual connection. So they left. they actually upped and left as a race. Probably not all of them, but whatever the group of these sons of the serpent, they actually exited out of Appalachia, out of Atlantis, and resituated their own civilization on the continent of Oceania, which we now call Lemuria, which is estimated to be where the Pacific is, you see. And they completely left, just exited out, leaving their alien fathers with a predicament of what to do. So what they did is they went back to the drawing board again to create another entity. It says, let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us. What shall we do to be invoked, to be remembered in earth? We have tried with our first creatures, look at this, but we could not make them venerate us. So then let us try to make obedient, respectful beings who shall nourish and sustain us. This is from a Mexican book, the Popol Vuh. Do you know the conquistadors, how many books they burned? You want to know why? If this is one little piece of one little book, right? Think what those books really contained, and now find out why they were burned. The first creatures wouldn't do it, so we go to the second. Genesis, by the sweat of thy face will be thy bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust thou art, and to dust thou wilt return. Does that sound like God talking to somebody? Or is it more of human politics? And the Lord said, behold, the man has become one of us, to know good and evil, and now lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Now, the interesting thing is that they did create another being, and that being they called the Adamic race, or we refer to now as the Adams, the Adam. But again, not an individual. The Adams and Eves were created, but they were called the Adamic race. And they had to think, when they created the second generation, offspring, they thought to themselves, what did we do the first time that was wrong? What we did the first time it was wrong is we gave the power to our first sons, the firstborn, the intellectual abilities and genius that we ourselves possess. And that's why they got all arrogant and took off. So the next time we make a group, our servants, we will literally dumb them down. We will close off the centers of the high intelligences that we have, the technological intelligences and so on. And, I mean, you can do that in a laboratory, a behaviorist laboratory now, just using the brain synapses. But they were doing it on a DNA level. So that's exactly what they did. They created a being whose intelligence level would be much more suppressed, and that was the Adamic race, and they sent them out to be the servants. And they had a feminine counterpart that could not at that time breed through mating, but they were feminine. The female versions. And the Lord said, look, the people are united, and they all have one language. Come on, let us go down, and therefore confound their language so they cannot understand one another's speech. Now, as I said, in the Bible, you'll hear certain terms, and you'll hear this term naked, that Adam and Eve went into the garden naked. Well, what does that mean? That God was wearing Levi jeans then, and everybody had clothes? The word naked is another, euphemism, a cryptic euphemism in the Bible that refers to a state of being in intellectual ignorance, nakedness, into the garden in a naked state, meaning that they had suppressed intelligence. But reduced intelligence of what, specifically? Remember how I just quoted those books where it says they cannot eat off the tree of life? Remember that? Well, the forbidden fruit, this term, the forbidden fruit of the tree of life, is another euphemism for the knowledge of human genetics. Because the tree of life symbol has always been the symbol for that, for what we call the caduceus of Hermes, or the DNA spiral. In ancient times it was known as the caduceus of Hermes, or before that the tree of life, because that's exactly what it is. And they said it has its roots in the earth and its branches in heaven. And then later that tree became known as the tree of good and evil. And all the people who think they're into the occultism go, the tree of good and evil, thinking that means something esoteric. Actually, it doesn't. This term does not refer to anything esoteric. It refers only to the two contingents or races and residents on this planet, both custodians and utilizers of the knowledge of genetics. The good and the evil, for want of a better term. It's their tree, meaning their knowledge. So naked and not being able to eat off the tree of life, not being able to eat off the fruit of the tree of life, is a euphemism for the Adamic race not having the intellectual ability that their masters had, the high scientific, technical knowledge of reproduction on that level, and the science of biology and technology. And that's what these symbols all refer to. Do you know in the Kabbalistic tree of life, anybody familiar with this? There are 22 paths. 22? Anybody in the genetics know the number 22 and the chromosomes on the DNA? So when we read about the forbidden fruit, we got to ask ourselves a question. This symbol is even styrated in the symbols of the chakras, or an analog to that, right? The forbidden fruit relates to genetics. If it doesn't, why is a technical company that expressly involves itself in technology having the same symbol from the book of Revelation? And they're not the only corporation that do this, there's many others. So back to like when we did in the first presentation, this concept of the serpent in the garden that has at least come down to us through the Bible. This concept of Adam and Eve being visited by a serpent. Now the interesting thing is that as this Adamic race was slaving away with no trade unions and no extra time and anything like that, overtime, working for their hidden masters, these Atlanteans, this became known to the sons of the serpent who were living on Lemuria, because they were probably keeping tabs, watching what their forefathers were doing. And they then had this predicament, didn't they? Because they said, look, we got free from these masters. We're doing all right over here with our high civilization and great culture. But they've created a second race, but they've used also the human DNA. So in a way, aren't they our cousins? Right? Aren't the Adamic race now cousins to us? But they're in a dumbed down state. So they said, we're in a bit of a predicament. What would happen if we went back in surreptitiously to Eden, into Atlantis, and told them that, and tried to get them to come with us? And that is exactly what happened. The serpent entered into the garden and discoursed with the Adamic race. But the stories of the ancient legends say that the Adams, the male ones, didn't kind of get it. It didn't make too much sense to them. But the Eves really got into it. Right? And they were very responsive to what the sons of the serpent were saying. And so would you, because they said that they were comely and attractive, had magical powers, tremendous intellect, but a divine spiritual ray, right, of great wisdom. And they came into the daughters and they talked to them, and the daughters of Eve said, hey, this looks like a good deal, let's get going, pack up. And they dragged the Adams with them. I've had some women say, why did they even bother doing that? But you know how things are, right? So anyway, a lot of them did leave. To cut a long story short, because the Eves understood this concept, somehow they started to exit. Again, maybe not all, right? But enough of a large contingency exited with the sons of the serpent, and the sons of the serpent said to them, know ye not your gods? What we can do, you can do also and more. So the coming of the serpent into the garden has been completely put before us opposite than what it was, for good reason, and it doesn't make any sense. But the fact that it hasn't made any sense doesn't seem to bother anyone, right? Because women are suppressed, they hold no office, everything works. But the very fact of the tree and the serpent, like I said before, goes back to the whole concept of Egypt and the mysteries of what? This very symbol of the tree and the serpent is your DNA, and the initiation back into that knowledge that was sequestered from you. And isn't it interesting, scientists will not like this one, isn't it interesting that women were the ones who took to that knowledge first? Isn't it always been that science was a male patriarchal thing that's been put before us? Science and the matriarchy are very connected. There's a long story about how science and the rise of science in the world is connected to the female matriarchal system that's been not covered a lot in our societies. Now, because the females, one more anecdote about this, is because the Eves were originally the most receptive to their teachers, the sons of the serpent teachers, that was never forgotten by the sons of the serpent. And later when they got to Lemuria, the Eves were given positions of superiority. They were what was called the beloved. And that is where we get the priestess classes and the matriarchal powers coming from. The fact that women were keepers of the secrets, initiators, right, and mystics, where we get this from comes from Lemuria and the connection to Oceana and the sons of the serpent. That initiating power. Because it was never forgotten that they were the beloved ones. You know in the Bible when it talks about Mary Magdalene being the harlot? That word harlot is a mistranslation of a word called herodulai. Herodulai, I think in Greek. And you know what herodulai means? Sacred or beloved one. Right? And Jesus, right, was meant to be the immaculate child, right? What's this connection again? And we find in the Bible. By the way, the Egyptian hierarchy